What's going on, everybody? My name is Nick.
I'm Dave.
And this is the Deep Dive, and we are in week 4 of our John Wesley series called Rooted. What are we talking about today?
We finished up the John Wesley series, and we're mostly going to be looking at this relationship that the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, had with George Whitefield. So we'll talk through that because I think there's some things for us to learn and to lean into from the way they handled their relationship.
Right on. Let's get into it. Well, Dave, I'm not going to lie. I'm still coming out of my deep, dark hole of regret for the Braves this postseason. It was hard to watch them go out the way they did, but kudos to the Phillies and all that for
You're a big baseball
dominating.
guy. You're a big baseball.
I am.
That's your go-to sport.
That's right. Yeah. If I had to pick one sport to watch for the rest, it'd be baseball.
Yeah. Well, as far as me, I'm wearing my hat backwards because I have a logo from a company that is very proprietary.
Yeah, and we don't want to get caught. We don't want to
get caught with that. So I was told I should turn my hat around. If I was going to take my hat off, but my hair looks.
So you're just trying to be cool today.
Well, I'm cool every day.
That's true. You are cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into it, shall we? Let's not beat around the bush. Let's just dive straight in.
All right. So, finished up this series on John and Charles Wesley. It was real well received. I think there were some people that were maybe new to Methodism or they enjoyed the review. And so, it's been fun for me to kind of talk through and remember and do a little research on as we have wrote out these series. But I saved this last one for the last because just in the climate that we're in today, with just the divisiveness in the world, I mean, we're, these tragedies that are going on like in Israel or in Ukraine, for lack of better words, sort of the nonsense that's going on in like Congress.
Yeah.
Where it's the place to find cooperation in the middle has seemed to be gone these days. You gotta run to the corners. And so enter into the story, John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield. And it comes sort of on the understanding where they fall in the context of history. They lived in the 1700s. Protestant Reformation was back in the 1500s. And following the Protestant Reformation, there were some of the most ugly, most brutal, most deadly wars that were ever fought. And they're oddly enough sort of an oxymoron called the religious wars.
Right.
Because oftentimes, all of the times, doctrine was the excuse by which they were embattled, whether it was Protestant Catholic things or a lot of times, Protestant things that were happening. And it's pretty disturbing. And when you look at our country today or our world today, well, of course there are wars, but in our country, I just think there's something from history. We need to learn that, at some point you've got to stop this warring with each other because it just leads down a slippery slope. And one of the things that I mentioned on Sunday, which I mentioned again today, was in Geneva, there was a period of time, about 17 years, that John Calvin, who we've mentioned before, and of course Calvinism and all that came out of his work, and that they had, I think it's somewhere in the 170s, like 173 people were killed, either beheaded or burned at the stake because of quote unquote heresy. So, and that some of it was what we would in the Christian church today in Orthodox Christendom say, yeah, that's outside of orthodoxy. Some things like the Trinitarian or somebody writing that there is no Trinity, those kinds of things. But it's still to think that you've got to this place where we think this person needs to be burned at the stake because of belief. I think of, Galileo, he was almost burned at the stake by saying that, it wasn't a concentric world, geocentric view, it wasn't concentric, geocentric view of the world where, the earth was fixed and everything. And the Catholic Church almost burned him at the stake for that. He had to recant that to save his life. And so this history was known by Wesley and Whitefield. And I just think also just their commitment to love and to the hand, head, and hearts thing we talked about. So just a quick little backstory, because I'm hoping that most people have seen the sermon or at least kept up with where we were. But when they were young adults, George Whitefield, John Charles Wesley, and a group of other pastors were members of what they called the Holy Club in Oxford. They grew very close. They did Bible study together. They did prayers, lots of prayers together, deep prayer. They also did acts of service with one another. And so when John Charles Wesley came actually to Savannah, George Whitefield took over the leadership of the Holy Club. So there is a very, very close knit group. And George Whitefield actually traveled around and worked raising money in preaching and raising money and awareness for the Wesleys when they were in Savannah. And so the Wesleys go to Savannah. They don't have a good time. That's another story. But they come back. And by this time, it's about 3 years later, and George Whitefield has continued his studies, and he has landed with a kind of different theological perspective, way of thinking about things than the Wesleys do. And so they're growing apart, at least theologically at this point. They're still working in ministry together actively, but growing apart and having some disagreements over theology. And so it kind of came to a head when I can't remember if he either preached or just published a sermon on Christmas Eve that was very much a defense of what we call predestination or election. And then the Wesleys then responded in the way that they do, with John Wesley publishing a sermon talking about free will, or Arminianism as we call it, and then a hymn that Charles Wesley. And so at that point, they began to get into this really deep debate about it. And I think it was probably pretty dicey for a couple of years. But a couple of things about it was they didn't do it publicly. We know about it because it's in the letters and the correspondence that we have with them. But it eventually led to a place where they had to go in parallel ways. They were both still in ministry, and they still had great affection for one another. And they put that above doctrinal things. Not that it was unimportant. It was super important.
Yeah.
Very important, just like our beliefs are. But their friendship and showing brotherly love was more important. And so one of the first slides that I put up in the sermon was this thing that sometimes gets attributed to Wesley. It's not original with him. We really don't know who it's original with, but possibly Augustine, which that goes way back in the very first centuries of the Christian church. And that is that in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and all things, charity. So, that I think is just such an important message for us today, because we're going to not agree on everything.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking, how many times I've had conversations with people who I might not 100% align with. They say something that they're just really heartfelt, and it's like, I don't know if I agree, or hearing pastors and stuff like that. But I think there's a space that you can learn to respect their opinion, but also be able to respectfully share yours as well. And I think when we get out of those spaces, it can create war, it can create tension, it can create real hardship. And, if I guess a question I would have for you, and maybe this is a place where we could go a little deeper, is, my daughter recently, actually, Olivia, she came up and asked me, she's like, what does it mean when somebody's pushing their religion on you? Mm-hmm. And so we kind of talked about that and explained it. And if somebody is trying to have a conversation about religion or whatever, how do they do it harmoniously, I guess? Like what's the attitude you should approach those conversations with? Like, does it make sense?
It does a little bit. I think it depends on the specific context.
Yeah.
We are to share the good news of the gospel and,
Right.
share the love of Jesus. But there are also places where, and I'm sure you have had as well, I've had friends, close friends, who are faithful, deep members of other denominations.
Yeah.
Some who believe some very different things than I do or our denomination
Yeah.
practices. And so we can, I think it takes to sort of this kind of understanding of like, we can talk about this in debate and, hey, here's my side and here's your side, and kind of listen to one another. And sometimes we might change, but most of the time we don't.
Right.
And so, but getting to the point of when it gets to the point where emotions are flaring and people are backing into the corners, I think that's the time to sort of like say, hey, that's enough of that for today.
Yeah.
Let's talk about baseball or something.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, because if the friendship is already there,
Right.
particularly.
Well, I think that's one of the beautiful examples that they set for us is they're, like, we're not going to fully agree on this, but we can still be in ministry kind of running parallel lives, like
Yeah.
we're kind of keep moving together.
Well, and I know how it must be for someone, because I've experienced a little bit of it myself, when I feel like somebody who is very religious in a certain way is trying to fix me
Yeah.
and my doctrine. And so they're kind of looking at me as a project, and, oh, he's a nice guy, but there's sort of this sort of pitying kind of thing that goes on. And that's not,
Bless your heart.
yeah, that's not a good feeling,
Right.
and I've seen, friendships really get messed up over religion, which ought to be something that brings us together and teaches us to love more deeply. And so, yeah, it's important. But I don't really know the particular context that Olivia was one.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, was speaking of, because, I've also been, the heavy-handed, like I remember when I was in college, like the people coming knocking on the door trying to share 4 spiritual laws, something going, hey, I go to church, but are you saved?
yeah.
And particularly if I don't know them, I was going like, I'm not having this conversation with you. I'm saved. Okay, move on. Go to somebody else who might.
Yeah.
So
I remember in college, I came across one of those guys, sitting on their box with a megaphone telling everybody why they're going to hell. It's like, if you're in a sorority, you're going to hell. You know what I mean? Like, and all this stuff. And I simply stopped and I just asked, why?
Yeah.
And then Brett Hill's like, you don't know anything about these people and their lives and what they're doing. You're making assumptions based on whatever. I was like, maybe get to know the people and your message will be heard a little bit.
Well, let's go back to specific context of John and Charles and George Whitefield. They were deeply invested in each other.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they had a time. And then, of course, Whitefield also went to America. And so, they weren't doing everyday life like they had been, but they were deeply, deeply invested in that to start with. The friendship was there, and the friendship had been based on faith.
Yeah.
And, their belief, you read it in the Wesleys, in the hymns and in the sermons and other writings, they were deeply of this free will. Last week we talked about the 4 alls of
Right.
Methodism, and the first one, that all can be saved. And so and since I come from that place, it's hard for me to get into George Whitefield's, shoes for a second. But, George Whitefield, with as much care and thorough studying, had ended up from a different perspective as far as that. And I will tell you, you can sit down and look in the Bible and you can interpret it either way.
Yeah.
And so that's where, kind of reason and experience or tradition, as we talked about, the quadrilateral came in. So he was very deeply committed. But they were so close. You know how you like sometimes fight with your brother or sister.
Yeah.
They were so close. I think they could have had, some probably more robust discussions, because they knew that the love was still there.
Yeah.
But I do think that it was, it wasn't easy for a few years until they got to a point where they actually kind of separated. Whitefield was, at least in their day-to-day ministries,
Yeah.
still great brothers, as we will talk about, particularly towards the end. But, I think part of what preaching this and studying and thought about it is like, if I can just put it on the table with a lot of what we're going on with in the United Methodist Church and the disaffiliation and the things that have happened. And yes, we've had people that that I'm very close to that have ended up in a very different position than I might have on it. And can we find a way to love alike?
Yeah.
And to say, hey, let's go and we can still be in ministry and still be brothers, but we may be doing kind of a parallel ministry to one another. And God can honor both those things because, I do believe we need different movements within Christendom because people's brains work differently,
Sure.
And so, when we draw this tight little circle that everybody has to believe exactly in the same way, it's hard to get to that. The mind cannot accept what the heart rejects.
Sure.
And so, like, if you drew me in a circle and said, you've got to believe in predestination. There's only, I would have a trouble ever accepting that in my heart because it makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to me because of the way I was raised, my tradition, my study, and all that. And, just trying to twist my arm and make me read things to get there, I don't think I would get there. Now, like Galileo, if you were going to burn me at the stake, I might say, well, yeah.
But at least for this conversation, whatever you say, I'm good.
Right. But, but there are people that have been like super committed to the point of martyrdom in those places. And, in that area in Geneva, Arminianism, or people believe in free will, was almost run out. All but, done away with. And the Wesleys were really kind of the renaissance of that in Great Britain when it came back. But the point is that they still became they always were these committed brothers to one another. And one of the stories that I think I can get most of the quote kind of right, but there was this conversation that George Whitefield had with one of his followers. And you can imagine when people get sort of amped up and like their beliefs and like, hey, Calvinism, or hey, Armin. He said to, and it talks, and this kind of points to this drawing the tight little circle, because one of the people with Calvin, one of his, not Calvin, with Whitefield said, we won't see Wesley in heaven, will we? And so, they're like the human nature. Yeah, they're not going to heaven. They don't believe exactly.
Yeah.
And Whitefield's response was, no, we won't see Wesley in heaven because he is going to be so much closer to the Savior than we were that we won't be able to see him.
Yeah.
And so that kind
I
of
thought that was such a cool quote.
It is a very, very cool quote, but it shows of their devotion to one another. And then when Whitefield died, Wesley, he had asked Wesley to do his funeral. And so Wesley did his funeral. And so, that also speaks of this deep relationship that they had. And how can we do better in emulating that with people that we disagree with, particularly people of faith that we disagree with?
Yeah.
Because I've seen friendships destroyed over belief. And honestly, Nick, I'll tell you this, sometimes I wonder if I wasn't a believer just by seeing the way that believers treat one another, much less the rest of the world. I wonder if I would be a follower, if it was just based on watching the behavior of some Christians. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, I do, and I've had that thought as well. Just what you see pop across social medias and stuff like that, of people arguing back and forth. I when I was doing youth ministry, I was a part of so many youth ministry groups, and every time like an issue would come up that like, oh, do we believe this or do we believe this or whatever, or somebody would like toss out, man, the people from different groupings, denominations, all that stuff, and they were berating each other, like to a point where admins would always have to step in or shut it down or whatever. And it's like, here we are, a bunch of youth pastors trying to help each other out, trying to be a place for us to figure stuff out. And we don't even get along on these like basic topics, you know what I mean? And I feel like that's all around us, and it's sad. It really is, because when I read the Bible, and I'm a simple guy, like there's definitely some complex places in the Bible, complex understandings and stuff like that, and I work to understand those spaces, but at the simplest form. Like, I see body of Christ. We're all working at it together. We might look at it from a different perspective in a different way. Like my hand doesn't do the same thing my eye does. Like that resonates with me. But also love. Like it's like how do we get so far away that we get so jaded on sprinkling versus dunking,
Right?
or
And
this or that?
those are the things. I mean, I will say there are things. It's not anything goes.
Yes.
And I don't think if people have heard me say that, I mean, I'm not talking about anything goes. There is orthodoxy, and we are tethered to that. Now, just because somebody might be outside of that orthodoxy is not for, having them beheaded or burned to the stake,
Exactly.
like in Calvin's time. But, I do think that there's a Christian way to respond to those who may be preaching what, for lack of a better word, we might say heresy.
Sure.
But where you draw that line and where that definition is, I look back to the Apostles' Creed in the Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church, the Articles of Religion. I look at those things. That's an orthodoxy. But even within those, there's some latitude of like understanding exactly what do you mean by that. And so, I mean, we need to draw our circles a little bigger.
Yeah.
And putting love before all. Not that those things aren't important. They're terribly important. They are. But if we're going to have a witness in this world today, people need to know we're Christians by our love.
Well,
And how we treat and respect one another.
and that's, to me, that's the big part is like, I've had conversations with people talking about various points, but when I get to know somebody and I hear their heart, and I hear their message so much clearer.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so I don't think if you get into a space where you're arguing faith or religion or whatever with somebody and they don't believe you, look at them and going, well, you're an idiot if you don't believe this. It's not the way to get it done. You got to show them by how you're understanding of, like how you're living into that, for them to go, maybe they're similar to, like to have them kind of respond and react.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I think that's true. I think, it's hard. I mean, it's hard work holding on to love in that way, because it's so much easier just to dismiss somebody.
Mm-hmm.
As painful as it can be, entire families being ostracized from one another, good friends but sometimes I think the commitment to stay together through that is actually harder work, but much more rewarding than just writing, dismissing, and throwing hand grenades from the other side of the room.
Yeah.
At that, and I've seen way too much of that. I've seen you talking about like those circles, and I know everybody's got their opinion about like the politics of the day, and I'm not don't do politics much. I mean, don't preach on it at all. But I mean, I look at the dysfunction of one of the parties right now. They can't get a speaker elected because of factions within that party. If it was on the other side of the aisle, it'd be the same way, because these little factions, we can't find the unity. And, we've got to find that messy middle, because if we're going to work together, and I think the church is the same, we've got to find that messy middle, and it's hard there. It's much easier and feels much more powerful in some ways to be in the corner yelling at each other, but it gets absolutely nothing done.
Yeah.
To find that place where we can agree to disagree and disagree without being disagreeable, it's much, much harder work.
And if you're asking me, Nick Yother,
Yep.
I want to follow the person who's willing to roll up their sleeves and do that work, more so than the people who are on one side going, "You stink."
I'm not going to vote for whatever, But yeah, like if someone would have the courage to walk out in the middle and say, "Hey, look, let's find people on both parties to come together and let's try to get some things done and find some things." And I know, I mean, that's oversimplifying a lot of stuff, but I would have tremendous respect for that. But I tell you, they can't get elected anymore because you've got to appeal to your special interests back home. And so people, we should be more committed to our own morals and our own, beliefs than we are trying to please other people, because you're never going to please other people. And we've got to have respect for people for at least trying.
Sure.
Oh yeah, maybe they didn't sign that one little thing that I would want them to sign, but look, they're trying to get something done, and I have great respect for that.
For sure.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Like, yeah,
It does.
And so, it's a lot of this. It seems like we've come back to this several times in the last couple of months as we talk about this. there is this idealism that I think is the Christian life. And, you can be idealistic in saying, that sort of rose-colored glasses of looking at stuff. I'm not saying any of this is not really, really tough to do, but I think we have to strive for that high idealism in the matter in which we are serving Christ and walking our lives with one another.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's worthwhile work, but at the end, part of it is just trying to be more like Christ. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Like it's hard, but it's also like, don't overcomplicate it either. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. Like, if we can love like Jesus, like we'll find the right orthodoxies, we'll find the right spaces, and we'll be able to push those things.
Yeah, and I am reminded that that Jesus was seemed to have less patience for the really, really religious people of the day who were drawing those tight circles on the wall and stuff like that than he did with just like the average sinner out on the road.
Yeah,
there's a lot more compassion there.
Yeah,
and that sort of points to it's really hard within that. We have to release things like what is my real motivation for this? Is it keeping some sort of power or some sort of popularity or control? And I think Jesus sees right through that and looks at the heart.
And I think in some of the spaces that I've got more of an inside look on even this disaffiliation process within the United Methodist Church, I'm starting to hear that more so is like as the splitting is coming more to a head and stuff like that, you're starting to hear more of the leadership kind of looking and saying like, how can I still learning how to still love in the midst of my own disappointment or in the midst of my own frustration.
How can we do this without bashing the edge?
Exactly.
And I'm not going to say we read it through the lens of church history and several centuries.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it didn't get to that point with George Whitefield and John Wesley and Charles Wesley. I'm not sure how. I mean, I know their letters could be pretty,
to the point.
They were duking it out.
Yeah.
And I'm not certain that I'm sure in their small little circles there was a lot of talking about the other. I'm just imagining.
Sure.
It just like what we're seeing today, and we're right in the middle of it now, and it hurts, and there's a lot of pain. But I just think we can look to these leaders as a way of being Christ-like, and we can look to other sections of history or other even parts of our contemporary world and saying, hey, we don't need to go that way. We need to remember who we're following here, and sure, it would have been great to be together forever, but maybe it's time for us to realize we just need to.
But also in the midst of these very public things that are being shown to the world, how we respond in that is also going to be a testimony to the bystander, the onlooker. You know what I mean? So
that's been pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'll end up with this. I mean, this is lighter. This is actually kind of gory. We're getting close to Halloween, but a couple of things I didn't mention. But might be interesting for you if you've listened to the podcast this far, is to Google Wesley's death mask, John Wesley's death mask. And this is something that seems pretty gruesome to us back then, but it was very done from kings to butchers to somebody important like John Wesley. They didn't have pictures back then unless somebody done a portrait. And so it was not an unusual practice for them to make this sort of mold of someone after they had died. And of course, we have John Wesley's death mask, and there's lots of copies of them in Methodist museums around. And it's a little icky, but at the same time, it's very interesting because you can find out some things from there. The other thing is we have in one of the Methodist Museum, George Whitefield's thumb. I think it's thumb or finger, one of his fingers.
They have a thumb?
Yeah. Apparently, in that time, too, it wasn't unusual that after someone's deceased is to cut off something like a thumb, particularly if somebody had been as important and it's well-known and well-respected as George Whitefield, to keep that prosperity. I don't know if it's like a rabbit's foot or something, but they did that back then. And you can go to, these Methodist museums and see some of that stuff, which is just so weird for us thinking about today. But
this feels like something out of National Treasure, that you need his thumb to unlock some some
Yeah.
box somewhere that's got all the historical.
Yeah, and I know it's kind of a weird way to end this study of Wesley and stuff, but I just thought that's interesting.
It is
for anybody that would that, and so if you're so inclined for extra credit and want to Google that stuff, you can easily find it on the internet. There's all kinds of pictures.
I'll probably do it. I'll probably go look it up.
Yeah, and stuff about
Here now.
that. But but there's also some great videos that you can I promise you if you were to go into YouTube and put Whitefield and Wesley, you can learn about their relationship. And it is something to be followed and to admired, I think, with the two of them, the three of them, actually.
Well, that kind of gets us to our finish line of this podcast, but also this series. As Dave said, it's been a fun series to kind of talk through, and again, almost like adult confirmation. You know what I mean? Like in some ways, as we have some kids going through confirmation right now, kind of learning back through some of these life lessons of John Wesley and just how he lived his life and stuff like that. It's just been cool. But where are we going next, Dave?
Well, we're the next couple of weeks, I think, are going to be, I hope, fun and interesting. We've got a couple of skits coming up with our drama group for the next two sermons, but it's called A Generous Life, or The Beauty and Generosity.
Okay.
So we're going to be looking at that, how God created us in to be generous people.
Nice.
God was generous with us. And so we're looking at that over the next couple of weeks. And so I'm excited about it. This week we're looking at a passage from Exodus 25, I can't remember, 31, and then Matthew 25.
Okay.
We'll be looking at the parable of the talents. And so anyway.
Get your cheat sheets out early, get a little run up so you know what's coming on Sunday. But
I definitely promise you we'll have some stuff to talk about next week. So,
okay, good. I like it.
Yeah.
Always fun to have good stuff to talk about on the podcast.
Yeah. And next week it's getting towards Halloween, because next week is our trunk or treat.
Next week is our trunk.
So as we're doing this next week, we're going to be
gearing up
for
ready,
that.
getting our costumes together, all that good stuff. And it's always a good time. That's such a fun event. I'm super excited for this year. And you should be as well. If you've got time, swing on by next Wednesday. What's the date? The 25th, maybe?
Something like that.
The 25th.
Yeah.
Come on by the 25th. We're starting at 5:30. We go to 7:30. And it's such a party. You got trunks to trick or treat at. Dave and his band will be here playing music. We got hay rides. It's just a great time. There's a free dinner, hot dogs, and all that good stuff.
On all the fixings, yeah.
That's right. So come on by, come check us out. It'll be a good time. But without further ado, you know where to find us if you have any comments, questions, anything like that. We appreciate you guys watching, and we'll catch you next time.
All right. And God bless everybody.